Hello and welcome to Public Speaking and Presentations. My name is Paul Kim and I am a lecturer and content developer with the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. I want to first thank everyone for taking time out to watch this video, and I look forward to sharing information in this part 1 as well as part 2 and 3. Before we begin, let me give a few information about the contents we'll cover in this video. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what we should do to prepare prior to speaking in public. We'll follow that up with some language and strategies for how to introduce ourselves, introduce the topic of our presentations, and we'll conclude this video with language and strategies for getting into the body of our presentation. So let's begin. Now, most people really dread or fear speaking in public. And one of the keys of having a good public speaking experience is to prepare thoroughly prior to getting on stage. And I have 3 simple tips. The first tip is to have a plan. And what I mean by having a plan is to think about the topic you're going to discuss, the audience you're delivering your message to. And that will really affect the vocabulary, your grammar, the expressions you're going to use. The second part about having a plan is to think about your main ideas and how you're going to deliver them. And I think the most important thing about having a plan is to create an outline, which leads us to our second tip. What I'm going to say is that many of us, when we have a speech or a presentation, we try to write the entire script. And I really discourage against trying to memorize your speech or presentation. As I mentioned in tip 1, have an outline. Because if you memorize your speech or presentation, 2 serious problems will be created. The first is that you will sound unnatural. And your audience is very smart. They will notice and they will pick up on the unnaturalness of your presentation. The second problem, I think, is even greater, and that is if you make a mistake, which most of us make a mistake in every single speech or presentation, but if you make a mistake and you've memorized your presentation or speech, it's so much harder to continue because you are literally rewinding in your mind. You're going through your script, and your audience can see that. On the other hand, if you just use an outline and you follow and memorize the main points of your outline, you're going to find your experience in speaking in public is much more comfortable and much more successful. The last tip I have is really keeping your speech or presentation short. And what I mean by this is that a majority of us try to put in all of this information in a very limited amount of time. And what happens there is that nearly every one of us forgets one point or maybe several points. And I really want to point out this is okay. Even the most professional speakers, every now and then, they forget some points in their speech or presentation. What I want to remind you, though, is don't try to throw in that information at the end of the speech or presentation. I sound like a broken record, I repeat myself, but just stick to your outline and you will find that your speech or presentation is going to be much more effective. So let's get right into some strategies and language in terms of how we introduce ourselves. Before we do that, I want to remind you as the viewer that I'm going to cover a lot of language and a lot of expressions, and I don't expect you to at all memorize everything. As a matter of fact, if you take these expressions and you change them to be more fitting to your own style, that'll be even better for you and more natural. But let's talk about a self-introduction. Many speakers I see actually forget to introduce who they are. And one of the benefits of an introduction is that it helps break the ice between you and the audience. Again, most of us fear speaking in public. We get on stage, we're nervous, but once you introduce yourself, you become much more personable and create more of a friendship. Plus, knowing who we are and our position, we don't have to think much about our own self-introduction. So you connect with the audience, you reduce the actual speaking anxiety that you would probably have when you get on stage. So let's look at some of the language. First of all, if you're in a formal setting, you're going to always want to give a salutation. For example, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. You can follow that up with something like, on behalf of Korea National Diplomatic Academy, my name is Paul Kim, I am a lecturer, and welcome to today's presentation on public speaking. Or you could say something like, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me to introduce myself. I am Paul Kim with the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Now, if you want a more or a less formal introduction, you can again give a salutation. Hello. Hello. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Paul Kim and I'm with the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Or something like, good afternoon. My name is Paul Kim with KNDA and I am delighted to be here today. Again, the benefit of introducing yourself is that you introduce yourself as a friend and it takes the stress or it relieves some of the stress of speaking in public. So let's get right into then the language and strategies of introducing the topic of your speech or presentation. Some simple language, you could simply say, I would like to take this opportunity to talk to you today about public speaking. Or, the purpose of today's presentation is to improve our public speaking experience. And lastly, today I'd like to show some strategies and language that will help you and benefit in terms of your public speaking experience. In today's speech or presentation, we'll look at several strategies and some language in order to improve our public speaking abilities. So again, we've introduced ourselves, we've introduced the topic. Let's get to the very crucial, important part of any presentation or speech, and that is given an outline. An overview is simply your outline of that actual presentation. And the benefit to you, again, because we're not memorizing our speech or presentation, the benefit to you is it's easier to deliver the speech or presentation. And for the audience, the benefit is they're able to know a roadmap, exactly what you're going to talk about when one section ends and another section begins. So just like I did in the beginning of this video, I talked about the video and I gave an overview. You can say something, for example, like, my talk is divided into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about self-introductions. Second, we'll talk about introducing the topic of your presentation. And third, we'll talk about starting the body of your presentation. You can also do something as simple as, allow me to begin with self-introductions, then introducing the topic. Or you could say, I will look at self-introductions first, next, introducing the topic of the presentation, then strategies for starting our presentation, and finally, how to conclude the presentation. And lastly, I want to give this example of, I'm going to take a look at some of the strategies of public speaking, but also looking at some of the challenges. Now, also during our overview, it's a great time to give expectations to the audience if you have a question and answer period, which most of us, when we give a speech or a presentation, especially in the corporate world, we're going to get questions from the people who are listening. So this is a good time to set that expectation to the audience. You can say something to the extent of, there will be about 5 minutes at the end for questions of this presentation. Or if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please leave them until the end and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Now, this brings us to our final part of this video, and that is actually getting into the body of the presentation. And what I like to advise for most people is to use some natural transitions or transitional phrases, or also remind them of what you talked about in the introduction of your speech or presentation. You can say something, for example, like, so as previously mentioned, I'd like to start by talking about self-introductions. Or, okay, to begin with, let's explore ways to creating a successful overview. Right. Let's start by looking at some of the challenges we encounter when we have to speak in public. Moving on, I'll start with some general information regarding public speaking. Then we'll move on to some strategies. Let's continue. I'd like to first give you some background information regarding the challenges of speaking in public. Then I'll give you some strategies and tips. That brings us to the end of this first video. I really want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for joining me. I sincerely hope you join us for part 2, continuing the actual presentation. We'll talk about transitioning from one section, concluding the presentation, and really what's important if you have a Q&A session, how to manage that, and some of the language that we can use in order to facilitate a good Q&A period. Thank you very much.